This is an NBC News special report. Here's Lester Holt.
Good day, everyone. We're coming on the air with breaking news. Donald Trump's former campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, has just been sentenced to prison again, this time in U.S. District Court in Washington, after pleading guilty last September to conspiracy to launder money and conspiracy to obstruct justice. You'll recall this follows a sentence of 47 months in prison in a separate case last week in Virginia. Manafort, a longtime Republican Party operative, turned 70 on April 1st and now faces years behind bars. Let's go right to our justice correspondent, Pete Williams, outside the federal courthouse in Washington. Pete, add it up for us.
So after a long tongue lashing from the judge, this sentence turns out to be relatively light, given that he could have gotten a maximum of 10 years in prison on the 2 counts that he faced. But Judge Amy Berman Jackson has sentenced him to an additional 3.5 years. Now, the actual sentence is longer than that, but some of it overlaps with what he was already sentenced in Virginia last year, which is just shy of 4 years. So you add the 3.5 that he gets today to the roughly 4 years he got last month. That's a total of 7.5 years. He gets credit for the roughly 9 months that he has served in prison. So he'll get out of prison and run these roughly 75 or 76 years old, depending on whether he gets time off for good behavior. Now, he did address the court today. He said, please let me and my wife be together. We need each other. I am sorry for my conduct. This is a bit of a contrast to what happened last week when he did not express any remorse. He said, I'm a different person than I was in October of 2017 when he was arrested. But this apparently did not impress Judge Amy Berman Jackson. She said it's hard to overstate the number of lies and the amount of fraud that he pleaded guilty to committing, hiding his income from the IRS, hiding it from his obligation to report foreign income to the federal government. Judge Jackson said she was surprised that Manafort did not write his own letter to her, which is a common thing for defendants to do before their sentencing. She said his attitude during this trial all along has been, look what they've done to me. And she said he squandered his chance to plea for a lighter sentence. Now, his lawyers said that he would not have been subject to all of this high-profile trial if it was not for the fact that he served for a short time as the campaign chairman for Donald Trump, and that all that attention has taken a heavy toll on him. But the judge said none of that matters, that the question of whether the independent counsel was right to bring these charges or not don't count. He's pleaded guilty. He's been convicted. He has to be sentenced for his crimes. The judge did start out this roughly 2.5-hour hearing by saying that her sentence today is not intended to be a revision of a sentence that was imposed last week by Judge Ellis. But bottom line here, Paul Manafort, who turns 70 years old on April 1st, is now facing a sentence of roughly 7.5 years in federal prison, minus the 9 months. He'll get credit for the time he's already served. Back to you.
And Pete, did the judge explicitly mention the overall Mueller investigation, collusion, those sorts of things?
Yes, she did. And the reason she did is because the defense in its sentencing memo before this hearing said there hasn't been any collusion, and that's been sort of a hanging over this whole trial. And they said, you know, there never was any evidence that Paul Manafort had anything to do with Russian meddling in the election. And the judge today said that's irrelevant. That's not what he was charged with. That's not what he'll be sentenced for. He'll be sentenced for hiding $16 million in income that he received from the Ukrainians for doing political consulting overseas that he never paid any taxes on, and instead used it to buy real estate and finance a lavish lifestyle. So she said that's what the sentence is about, and the whole collusion business, which the defense has carped on repeatedly, doesn't count.
All right, Pete Williams, and on that, let me turn to NBC's Peter Alexander at the White House. Peter, clearly the president seized after the last sentencing seized on this notion that this wasn't about the Trump campaign. Have we heard anything in reaction to this, acknowledging it's only been a couple of minutes?
Yeah, Lester, we haven't yet heard from President Trump. We'll have the first opportunity to see him this afternoon when he holds an unrelated event about drug trafficking in the Roosevelt Room. He'll be pressed by reporters, I suspect, during that briefing, so we may hear from him then. But of course, hanging over this case has been the question of whether President Trump would ultimately pardon his former campaign chairman, Paul Manafort. We heard from him last year when he said that he wouldn't take it off the table. Just last week, he said that I don't even discuss it, but he has been really deliberate in his praise of Manafort. Just a matter of days ago, he said specifically that he felt very badly for Manafort, said that I think it's been a very tough time for him. In the past, he's described him as a good man. Compare that to what we heard from the judge, Amy Berman Jackson, today, saying that he was not being honest with her, has not been honest throughout the entirety of the proceedings that she's been overseeing. He even said that a significant portion of his career has been spent gaming the system. So again, these are the 7.5 years that he now faces as a result of this. The president could pardon him. However, state prosecutors in Manhattan are said to be considering charges there that would not be erased because they take place in New York State by what happens in federal court. Lester?
Peter, thank you. At the White House, let's bring in NBC News legal analyst Danny Cevallos. Danny, after the last sentencing, there was a lot said, a lot of criticism about what many saw as a relatively light sentence. Adding these two up, does this seem in line with what you would typically see in these kinds of cases?
I did not expect in either the Eastern District of Virginia case or in the District of Columbia case that Manafort would get a guideline sentence. In other words, there's a sentencing range in D.C. because the guidelines range was so high it was beyond the statutory maximum. In other words, the sentencing guidelines recommended an illegal sentence. So therefore, 10 years was the maximum and the advisory sentence. But still, in cases like this, it's not unusual for a judge to go below the guidelines and fashion a creative sentence in the form of a partially concurrent, partially consecutive sentence. That way, the judge imposes a sentence she believes fits the crime, but gives Manafort a break by allowing at least some of that sentence to overlap with his prior existing sentence. The sentencing guidelines say that the judge should sentence to concurrent sentences for relevant conduct, but for 15 years now, the sentencing guidelines have been only advisory, so the judge here had the power to do whatever she wanted.
All right, Danny, thanks for the breakdown for us. And once again, former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort has just been sentenced to an additional 3.5 years in prison for a total of about 7.5 years. We'll have complete details coming up on NBC Nightly News and, as always, on the NBC News app. For now, I'm Lester.